How are you doing today, Richard?
Very good, thank you. How are you?
Absolutely fantastic. What a brilliant landscape of ideas when it comes to this book. I mean, because it puts us in a time period that let's be honest, long gone and forgotten until you pick up this book.
You know, I think so. And one of the things that's happened is when Don McLean's hit American Pie, that was a smash hit in 1971, and it ingrained in people's minds this notion of the day the music died, when Buddy Holly and Richie Valens and the Big Bopper died in a plane crash. And since then, it seems everything just sort of followed that line of thinking. And as I was sitting back and I was thinking about some of this music, there was so much great music during the early 1960s, I decided what I wanted to do was try to put it back into the spotlight, not just musically, but also historically and culturally.
Yeah, because we need the stories. There are too many songs that are being played. I mean, even for the millennials and Generation Z, they're hearing the songs, they like the songs, they don't know the story of the songs.
Yes, I think that's very much true.
But you know, or even the fact that you and I were collecting 45s. I mean, I still run into kids now that they go, "What is a 45?" And I go, "You have no idea what it was like to go searching for that 45."
That is true, isn't it?
And
I think what did it for me too is a friend of mine who I've known for a long time, and he came of age during the early '60s, and we were talking one day out at lunch, and what he said basically was, he said, there was no good rock and roll in the early 60s. It was just pop. And he said it really disparagingly. And I said, what are you talking about? And I started throwing out names like Roy Orbison and Gene Pitney and the Shirelles and Ray Charles. And he said, oh, yeah, I guess you're right. And that's when it dawned on me, too. It reinforced this notion that I really wanted to write about that era because it seems to be sandwiched in between the 50s and Elvis Presley and Chuck Berry and all those early pioneers, and then the Beatles when they hit in 1964 with the British rock invasion. And as a result, people just sort of lost track of it until they stop and think.
Yeah, because what kept it going in the first place was the fact that we were loving the music because music was what we could get in our cars, and we were glorifying the music. But there's one thing that you bring up here, though, is that you say that music kind of faded, rock and roll kind of faded in 1963, and I've always looked at that period as being something big was about to happen, and when it popped, it was the Beatles.
Yes. And I don't think there's any coincidence there in terms of what happens, because one of the things that amazed me when I was doing this book, and I went back and I was researching the artists who had been dominant on the charts, and then all of a sudden when the British rock invasion hits, they're cold. I mean, they can't buy a hit during that time period. And there's no coincidence that November 22nd, 1963, Kennedy's assassination, and then just a few weeks later, the Beatles are going to hit. Mm-hmm. And I think the Beatles offered something new at the time that when kids in the United States were looking for a new identity, they provide that in some ways.
You bring up a really interesting point because I've had this conversation with coworkers and things where I said every time that there was a big moment in music history, there was a bad moment in history itself. And you just talked about it with Kennedy.
Yeah, well, I would agree with you 100% on that. It's really interesting. In fact, one of the things I point out in the book is just months before the Beatles finally hit, and this is dating back to early 1963 now, Swan Records, which was initially partly owned by Dick Clark, but he had divested himself of Swan Records after the Paola scandal hit. But Clark still was very good friends with both Bernie Benick and Tony Mammarella, who owned Swan Records. Swan Records had an exclusive on the Beatles. All they had to do was sell 50,000 copies of a Beatles song. It was She Loves You. All they had to do was sell 50,000 copies, and they would have exclusive rights to the Beatles in the United States forevermore. Clark agreed to allow them to basically to get out there with She Loves You on Rate a Record, which was a segment of Dick Clark's American Bandstand show. And I don't know if you're familiar with that, but teenagers out of the audience would basically sit down. Clark would play a song, and then they would rate it. It's got a good beat. You could dance to it. I give it a 92 or whatever.
Yep.
On this particular occasion, Clark plays She Loves You by the Beatles. And again, this is early 1963. And the kids on Radar Record absolutely hated it. They didn't like the sound. And when Clark later saw a picture of the Beatles with their long hair, Clark just kind of laughed and told Tony Mammarella, there's no way this group is going to make it in the United States. And as a result, what's going to happen is Swan Records doesn't put any publicity behind it at all, and they're not going to sell nearly 50,000 records, and they lose all the rights to the Beatles. And later on, Clark asked him, he said, why didn't you just buy the record yourself and you would have had the Beatles? And Tony Mammarella just shook his head and he said, you played it on Radar Record, and we thought we had a stiff on our hands because the kids only gave it a 72. And so they lost all rights, not to mention millions and millions of dollars in the process.
Oh, Richard, that's how I used to buy music. I would sit there on Saturday morning watching American Bandstand, and Dick Clark would do that, and the first thing I'd do is I'd hit the nearest music land.
There you go. And in this case, it didn't hit. But I think that brings up an important question, and that is why we, just by the end of the year, is it about face? And all of a sudden, the Beatles hit it big. And one of the things that's very interesting that most people don't realize now is prior to 1964, almost, I would guess 95% to 99% of all the artists who were making it on top 40 radio and the rock and roll charts were Americans, born and raised in the United States. Anything that wasn't American was considered not really rock and roll. All of a sudden, it changes after Kennedy's death, and it was hard for American artists to break through because so many British rock invasion artists were making it. So it clearly suggests something's happening there by late 1963, early 1964.
Yeah, because isn't that the reason why Tom Petty moved from Florida and went to California? Because he had to reinvent himself. And I've even known some people that there was a group on the East Coast called the Invictus. They were finding success until the Beatles came. And to sit down with them to talk about that moment, oh my God, those are fighting words.
Oh, yeah. In fact, some of the artists that I interviewed talked about that, saying that things really changed once the Beatles hit because they couldn't get booked or they weren't getting airplay or anything else. So yeah, you're right.
With as much as you put into the roots of music, do you find yourself that in the years ahead that you'll put focus on Timberlake as well as Justin Bieber, because it seems like their story is going untold as well. We're getting the TikTok version, but we're not getting the real story.
I'm sure that's true. Yeah. And I think one of the things that happens that's a big change from the period that I'm writing about in the early 60s, and this would apply to the 1950s and the first few years of rock and roll as well, is back then there was top 40 radio.
Yep.
There was American Bandstand. Everybody across the United States, in terms of teenagers, those kids were listening to the same songs. And those basically mean that it gives them shared memories from the 1950s and the early 1960s. And to this day, sometimes some of those fans can tell you, Buddy Holly and the Crickets, for example, appeared on the Coral label. It was sort of a maroon color, and that's where their hits were. They could tell you little details because all of those kids were listening to the same stuff. Nowadays, it's much more splintered because of streaming and other types of changes that have occurred in media.
Oh my God, I can so relate with that because I'm a mobile entertainer and I do still do high school dances and stuff like that. But they'll run up to me with those smartphones and they'll say, play this one, play this one. I'm going, I don't even know who that is. Where did you find that? And here I am thinking I've got everything.
Sure. I mean, and things have changed as a result of that, and something's gained by that because certainly it allows artists today to break out in different ways with how their music is being heard. Whereas back then there were more gatekeepers that their playlists were pretty strict in that sense. But at the same time, I think something is lost in terms of generations aren't being pulled together in the same way that people were pulled together with the Beatles. Like, is there any artist out now who would basically have the same impact as the Beatles. I don't think so.
Yeah, and one of the things that you cover in your book as well, and the name of the book is Rock and Roll in Kennedy's America, is the fact that what I love about music history are the regions that music comes from, and that's, I think, is one of the missing factors in today's sound, is that it's like we don't think region, we think global.
Yes, I think you're right. Because, again, there are different markets in terms of what people are aiming for. But, yeah, that comes through, too. And I think a lot of that is because of production technology has changed, too. Mm-hmm. Whereas back then, if you heard a record, I'm thinking things like Fats Domino, that you could tell it was coming out of it had a certain sound coming out of New Orleans, or the Beach Boys, or Dick Dale coming out of California. It gave you a totally different sound that was distinct to that area. Whereas now, it's hard to tell where these things are being produced because everybody's using the same technology, and it's kind of smooths the rough edges and everything else. Back then, people used to applaud the rough edges in some cases.
And they would appear together inside that studio. These days, they're just sending their tracks through an email. Yeah,
that's another big change that's occurred.
Yeah, where's that relationship at?
Yeah, I know. and even back then, though, in the early 1960s, when they start bringing in violins, and that was a real breakthrough after 1959, and you would hear that brill building sound in New York City, but also being applied to country music and pop rock and other forms of music, R&B rock as well, and that gave it a distinct sound. But again, like going back to what you just said, all of those people were in the studio together. And you could hear those violins sometimes. They would bring in 3 or 4 violins and a cello, and it'd be right in the same studio with them.
So now, where does the book grow from here? I mean, I realize that it's out now. It officially belongs to those that are just cherishing the history of music. But for you personally, do you take this to a podcast? Do you take this to Netflix? Because you've got a wealth of knowledge. Now it's time to see it at the next level.
That's an interesting point. At this point, now don't forget, my book was released on November 29th, so I'm still thinking in terms of the book now, in terms of what's going on. And what I've also done is, with Johns Hopkins Press, they really enjoyed the book and liked it, and so they've basically contracted with me to write 2 more volumes, which in effect is going to be a trilogy of rock and roll's first decade. So I've got work cut out for me ahead in terms of doing those kinds of things. But yes, you're right. I mean, and I think that's the interesting thing, that for people, it's important to hear the music, not just read about it, but also hear it, which you could do on podcasts, you could do on the radio. And one of the marvelous things that is just on YouTube. In fact, I probably couldn't have done this book without YouTube, because I would go onto YouTube and I could find these really obscure songs that I wanted to listen to, which is something people couldn't have done at an earlier time. So, you're right. I mean, I think there really is a market out there for this type of thing, particularly since this is the music of a particular generation, like I mentioned earlier. And as these people age, they want to hear more about the songs. Yep. And one of the reactions that I'm getting is from some people, they'll go, I know that song, I've heard that song, 10,000 times, but I've never thought about what it tells you about American history or culture. And that's what I'm trying to do in this book, trying to provide that kind of backstory so people understand the connections between the music and what's going on in the country, either back in the 60s or the 50s, or if you fast forward today as well.
I needed this book in my radio career. I've been in it for 43 years, and back in those days, the only thing we had was Joel Whitburn, and we trusted Joel's word. We needed books like this, and I'm so proud of you, Richard, for putting this together, because it's more than a book of nostalgia for people my age. It's, like I said, it's an invitation, because they've commercialized all of these songs, but those that are hearing it, even in the commercials on television, they don't know the story, and you are the one that's helping to push that door open.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
You got to come back to this show anytime in the future. You said you've got 2 more volumes, so I expect to talk to you 2 more times, mister.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Well, you be brilliant today, okay?
You too.
Thank you.